The transportation and logistics industry has its own set of challenges. In the hot seat, industry thought leaders take on M&A and what's driving the future of transportation and logistics. Are you ready for the hot seat?
Welcome to In the Hot Seat with the Tenney Group. I'm Spencer Tenney. It's good to be with you. My next guest has the do's and don'ts of logistics tech investing. With me, I have Director at S&P Global and Senior Technology Editor at Journal of Commerce, Eric Johnson. Welcome to the Hot Seat.
Thanks so much for having me, Spencer. It's really great to be on the show.
Well, I'm excited that you're here. We're going to heat things up in just a minute. But before we do that, Eric, why don't you just take 30 seconds, tell us a little bit about what you're working on.
Sure. So I have spent 20 years reporting on the logistics industry. Went to school for journalism, have been a career journalist, and the last 20 focused really very specifically on logistics. The last 6 of which have been with the Journal of Commerce, where I head up our coverage of technology, and that cuts across all the different software categories and product categories that touch international freight and domestic freight. So I probably spend about half my time on the domestic side and half my time on the international side.
Well, I love that. So with that, let's jump right in. Now we talk about technology. I've been dying to ask you some of these questions, Eric. So as you think about the logistics industry as a whole, what is the general understanding or aptitude when it comes to specifically automation and AI?
So this has been the big subject, I would say, over the last 18 months or so. I mean, I think you can probably trace it back to when ChatGPT came on the scene, which was sort of the tail end of 22, early 23, kind of changed everyone's sort of interface with AI and automation. Before then, I think it felt very much like an abstract notion, something that computer programmers understood or engineers understood, but the common person didn't. And then all of a sudden you have this tool in your hands on your phone you can download, and you start to understand what AI means. It's not like a movie. It's not, Terminator. It's not iRobot. It's like something that's actually interfacing with you. So that started to change the nature of how companies that both serve the logistics industry and the 3PLs and shippers and carriers themselves. And those are just some of the entities. Obviously, there's a million more different entities, but that started to change the way they started to think about how they could incorporate automation and AI. So I would say big picture, we're still at the very, very early stages of adoption of automation, much less actually AI. Certainly every software company in almost every industry right now is either using AI or thinking about how to use AI in their product. Mm-hmm. One thing I sort of mention anytime I talk to an audience is if a company, especially in a domain as sort of specific as logistics, comes at you saying our product is AI rather than a product that solves a specific problem and we use AI to solve it, run as fast as you can for the hills, because AI is not a product on its own. It's a tool. It's like a tool, right, like a hammer. I think we have a lot of room to run on where this goes, and we're still collectively trying to understand what it all means. If I could sort of maybe put some sort of like context to it, there's a lot of automation going on right now on routine processes, data entry, transferring data from one system to another. That's already happening. Extracting information from emails, that's already happening. I think the next sort of stage of this is, does the automation sort of make decisions that humans have typically been entrusted to make? So we're not, that's happening in pilots and very, isolated situations, but it's certainly not widespread yet.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. I think that in general, if I'm understanding you correctly, that that the adoption or a wide scale adoption is not quite there yet, as much you might think, but there's certainly some adoption. So I'm curious, like what are some of the areas of adoption that you find surprising? Like, hey, we're a little further along than I would have expected at this point.
Well, I mean, this is logistics, so I'm not sure I'm surprised that anybody's further along than I would have expected. I don't mean that. I think there's a reason why this industry has been like sometimes reluctant to be on the cutting edge of technology, right? It's a complicated industry. You have a lot of different parties that need to work with one another. There are meaningful consequences if you get something wrong in a cycle, at the wrong part of a cycle. So I don't know if there's anything I'm surprised that's farther along than it is. I think most people would probably be surprised to see how much automation is happening on basic sort of blocking and tackling aspects. Let's say truckload, right? I mean, a lot of brokers are now introducing automation on the booking side of things, quoting across all modes. That a lot is automated for a lot of forwarders and brokers, and even some ocean carriers, right? And truckload carriers. So some of the individual components, that's what I was getting at before, is sort of some of those individual components are already automated, and people may not even realize they are on the back end. You're seeing the result of that automation, but you're not actually necessarily seeing like what's under the hood. And sometimes even the operators within the companies that are using the automation aren't necessarily aware of how automated something is.
It's interesting. The expression you think or you understand with your head, but you kind of speak with your wallet. And so, I'm curious. We see kind of a conceptual adoption or an acceptance that, hey, this is the way that it's going to be. But what are you observing on the investing side? This is budget season. How are small, mid-size, large carriers thinking about investing in AI and automation as they look into 2025?
Well, I think every carrier of any sort of size is going to have some budget set aside to sort of play around with this, if they haven't already. And I would suspect, most of the carriers that we interact with, this is very much on their radar and has been for a while. And it's more about whether it's pilot stage, whether they are building something internally, they have the resources to build some automation internally, or whether they are, turning to an outside partner. There's vendors that specialize in certain, fleet dispatch or, route optimization. Obviously has been around forever, but like, how can you use automation or at a higher level AI to sort of even fine tune that much more? So the short answer is everybody is, this is on the roadmap now. The question is the question is who is investing in it or developing it in a way that it's a competitive advantage and not just a price of entry type of investment, right? And so I will be brutally honest and say I don't have people opening up their to take that analogy again. I don't have people opening up the hood and showing me all of the differentiating type of stuff that they're doing, because I think they see that as a short-term way to get way ahead of the rest of the market. But there's not a single truckload carrier of any size, or LTL carrier for that matter, that is not investing in this in some way. And so I think the feeling should be, if you don't have the ability to keep up with that internally, you have to be looking to an outside vendor to at least have a conversation and say, like, what can we do to bring this into our process, basically.
Right.
So yeah, the investments are there. I think from an investment standpoint, I think, how do you turn that into an ROI, right? It's a really hard thing to say, we just need to invest in something because there's this sort of broader imperative to do it. Financial metric that you attach to it, right? So are you able to minimize the amount of people associated with a specific process? Or more business, right? Those have to be the metrics and those are the traditional metrics, right? It's just, how do you apply automation to improve those metrics?
Great point, Eric, which I think you kind of point out or point to what I think is another issue, is just there's so many folks that intuitively know in order to be competitive, they have to make investments here. But the tension is that things are developing so fast that if they go big on a particular investment, it's just, does that become obsolete in a matter of, a very short period of time before they can get an adequate return on investment? So what are you observing? Like, how are people processing just the array of different options that they could consider investing in to increase efficiencies? Like, how do they make sense of it, and how do they get comfortable about ultimately putting dollars around some type of technology?
It is, you're not wrong at all. It's an overwhelming sort of situation right now. I think one thing I think about a lot is how ill-equipped most people in the logistics industry, freight industries, are to make determinations about what a good AI investment is. Like, none of us really went to school, stutter. Like, if we had three algorithms put in front of us, could any of us determine whether one was better than the other? Like, you'd obviously have to do it on a product usage and execution and efficacy basis, right? That's the only way to really understand if something is going to work for you. I mean, there's the obsolescence issue. There is something just didn't work, right? Like, it was promised to do this, and it may be a great product, but it didn't work for us, or it was promised and it wasn't a great product and it didn't work. So you have all this potential scar tissue that can form. I don't know if there's any magic bullet. Like, we can't make the market that is aiming to empower AI and automation smaller, right? That it is only going to get bigger. There's only going to be more money put into it. So it's going to be a very complex market to think about from an investment standpoint. I'm going to steal a line that I heard last week at a conference from a guy named Scott Friesen at Echo Global Logistics. Super smart guy, does analytics for them. And he said, make a list, sit down with your executive leadership and make a list of the things that your company does at scale with human beings. What are the things that take up the most amount of FTE hours? Or make a list, if you don't want to do that, make a list of the things that are the most impactful to your business, and figure out what components within that list could potentially be automated. And then go out and find a vendor that automates that component and see if it's worthwhile.
Yeah.
Do a pilot, right? So you really have to piecemeal it. You have to make it into a digestible problem. Because if you just say, we need to transform our entire business with AI, like, what does that even mean? Like,
right. That's an expensive proposition to begin the conversation there.
It's expensive. And also, like, I don't even know if most people, even some really smart people, would even know what the first step in that process is, right? So you have to be really specific with this, because I think the biggest problem with buzzwords is they just have a million different meanings for people. Yeah. It's not that they're all empty and useless and overhyped. It's just that they mean a lot of different things to different people. And so you have to be as specific as possible.
I really like what you said in terms of passing along the comment from Echo, because what I heard was, as long as you start with your most painful and expensive problem, you won't be wrong in terms of the technology that, like, as far as you match that up with a corresponding technology to address that problem. Right. I think where people get in trouble is they go look for whatever the best technology is, what has the most sizzle, and then try to fit that to whatever may be going on in their organization. And
it's probably not. It might not be a problem they have. It might be a great product, but it's not a problem they have.
But also, I think from a peace of mind standpoint, if you want to get comfortable with your investment, it's not that hard. You say, like, well, hey, whether it's perfect or not, I know it's going to create this amount of savings, and I can't not have that. So I think that's a really pretty. I think that's a great approach to that you shared with us. 100%. I want to back up a little bit. It's been a roller coaster of a ride. M&A, tech investment, all across that universe. Yep. How are things different? Like, talk to us about, like, kind of the evolution between the way that investors look at freight tech during the pandemic, and then maybe how has that evolved since then?
Well, I think actually it's a great question. I think about this a ton. So it's right in line with what I think about. I think you actually have to back up a few more years, right? So I think about um, sort of when I first started covering logistics, there was an era where it was sort of the era when software vendors catering to the logistics world were convincing the market that things like cloud and SaaS and multi-tenant software was okay, and a subscription payment model was okay, right? That was the thing that they had to get people comfortable with. Right about at the time when the industry got comfortable with that, then all of a sudden venture capitalists started emerging as an asset class that cared about logistics
Hmm.
suddenly. This was around 2012, 2013, if my memory serves me right. So I think you really need to look at the evolution of how that changed investing into software um, in our industry up until the pandemic, because there was a lot of foundational steps that were put in place on the venture capital side between 2012 and 2020 that all sort of reached a crescendo in 21 and 22, and then fell off that crescendo pretty precipitously in 23. I think, like a lot of things with our industry, 24 feels like a year where everything sort of got back to a little bit of a even keel. I won't say equilibrium, because I don't know if there's ever an actual equilibrium. We're always either above or below it, right? But um, the number of investments that are being made seems rational. The amount of diligence that I'm hearing that's going into deals is a lot more methodical for the amount of money that's being invested on the venture side. Um, and I think, I mean, I'd almost ask you this question, right? I think what's been interesting over the last 12 years or so is there have just been a ton of companies created that the decade before would have never been created because they never would have had a vehicle to raise the capital.
Right.
And all of a sudden they had it. And in my view, all those companies that were created over the last 12 years, there's not been a ton of M&A activity related to them. There's been a few here and there. There's been a couple
Yeah.
companies that have made some investments. We haven't seen this sort of like big bang of companies merging with one another, and this giant company that got a ton of funding merging with this giant company and actually creating an opportunity to IPO. It's just been a lot of like companies sort of spinning off and trying to figure out what their next, evolution is. And it's very interesting to observe. I'm sort of glad that I don't have to be the one to actually make decisions on what to invest in, because it's
Right.
incredibly confusing, right? Both on the M&A side, but also on the like, do I use their product side? So
Now, Eric, I
um,
was already confused. I brought you to bring the clarity to the conversation. So, so,
I I
so,
don't I don't know if I have any clarity. I wish I had. If I had some clarity, I don't know. I'd probably have a job as a fortune
yeah.
teller. But
What I'm hearing you say, and I would echo this is when you have an environment where there's a normalized level of discipline, where some of this is based on there has to be an economic thesis as part of an investment. It's not just hype and sizzle. And yeah, then you do have fewer transactions because there's a host of tombstones of things that didn't go well. And so I think there's certainly a greater sensitivity in the market. But the other point is this, and this kind of leads to my next question. Um, Never before, from our vantage point, has there been a greater burden on the technology to demonstrate a clear differentiation from what else is in the marketplace from an investment standpoint,
yeah,
and versus the cost of recreating the same thing. And so how do you think about that when you have such an abundance of available technology in the marketplace? How do
why do we need
folks?
one more? Why do we need
Yeah.
one more version of something that already
Well, I'm just saying, how do
exists?
folks different? Like, how do you see and how are you observing folks differentiating in a way that results in securing capital, either for an exit or to raise capital?
I call this the craft brew corollary, right? Like I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm not entirely sure how 18,000 different craft breweries in the U.S. all make the same version of an IPA and all still somehow have a business, right? Somehow, I guess that market is also fragmented, and the logistics industry is very fragmented. And I think people who were new to this industry on the investor and even founder side underappreciated the reasons for it being fragmented. I think there's a reason why it's fragmented. It's not fragmented by accident, or it's not a fault in the industry that is fragmented. I think actually the industry sort of in a way prefers to be fragmented. But to your question, I'm not sure. I mean, I wrote a month or two ago about a new truckload TMS for shippers. And you in a vacuum, you're like, how in the world did that get $1 of investment? You could literally go on Google and go 15 pages deep and find TMSs and not run out of all of the options, right? So I still think on the venture side, there's a huge bias, and I don't mean bias in a bad way. I mean bias toward like why you make a decision.
Yeah.
Bias toward their feeling about the founder, something special about the founder. They want to put money into this person or this team, almost regardless of what the product is. They're figuring that something about this person or team is going to figure out a way how to make money in this industry, right? And so maybe the initial product is just sort of something to pivot off of rather than the final baked, product. I do think there is now going to be a deep reluctance to invest in sort of digital intermediaries. I think those things, I think we've seen hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars go into certain intermediaries. Convoy, of course, went under, and primarily because what is the value in the market for that entity, and how does that relate to how much was invested, how much people expect to make out of that transaction, preferential, secondaries, do the early employees even get any cut of that in a deal, right? Like, so some of the math I think just doesn't work out anymore. So that I think is off the table. Now we're looking more at what are the SaaS products that investors are still very interested in backing, whether they're a new version of something that already exists, just a kind of cooler, more efficient, cleaner version of something that already exists, or a new category, which brings its own problems because you spend 2 or 3 years educating the market on what that category is before they might even be ready to buy it. Mm-hmm. So that's not exactly what a venture firm wants to see, right? You don't invest in someone going, hey, we're going to spend the first 3 years educating the market about what the category we're creating is. So
yeah, that doesn't the economics of that don't tend to work out. So,
no, exactly. which is why I think you've seen a lot of sort of copycat is probably a derogatory way of putting it, but just something that people have a mental framework for, a product. It's easier to sell a better version of that than it is to say, actually, there's this thing you've never used before that you need to figure out how you'll use it. But once you use it, it'll be amazing. Right. So,
yeah. No, so related to that, I mean, as you look to the future, we kind of talked about the history going back to 2012. As we look to the future and you're thinking about possible trends in the area of freight tech investing across logistics, all technologies, like what are some things that you would expect us to see?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I think I said automation. That's kind of an easy one, right? Like I think the automation that's obscured from people's workflows is very interesting. The things that kind of work in between systems, I think is a natural. One thing I think about again, that's sort of, because I will say I hear a lot of vendors now talking about, I want to make something that doesn't disrupt people's lives. I think that did not work for 10 years. Like, it's one thing to make their lives easier. It's another thing to say, you have to use our product as well as 20 other new products. And that's somehow going to make your life easier. No, it didn't, right? Most companies invest in something 5 years ago. It may not be perfect, but it's not, it gets the job done. And so I hear a lot of vendors talking about, how do we do something that doesn't disrupt the way a company works, but just makes it more efficient or better. I also think that the industry is sort of gravitating toward what I'll call a platform approach. So, if I think about, let's go back to that 2012 era. If I was benchmarking the industry, and back then I was working for another publication, and we would do benchmark studies on technology usage, and almost universally, their ambition was, I need to shrink the number of systems I'm using. I have 5 TMSs and 2 payment systems and 3 procurement systems and 5 other things that touch logistics. And the goal was, I need to rationalize that into maybe 3, right?
Right.
Now, I think the approach is, you have a main sort of backbone system, and then you're open to working on with a bunch of different vendors, or maybe an internally kind of built product as well. And it's really about how you connect all those things. It's not about migrating to one system, but there's room for actually companies to work. And that's not easy, right? Like, I'm sort of making it seem like all you do is just plug something into a wall and all of a sudden it works beautifully. Like, there's complications in that. But that, to me, is a more realistic way for a company to innovate than to say, actually, we're going to just use one suite of software that's going to do all of these things. And it has the advantage of being, one company's product, and it's going to be so nice. And then 8 years later, it's like, well, that didn't go so well. So, and the reality is, a lot of single suite of software are not as unified as people would like to have you believe, right? Like, a lot of these products, even within the same banner, are still pretty isolated from one another. So the platform thing seems to make a lot more sense to me in terms of how you conceptually approach.
Well, I think probably, and I've heard similar sentiments, and really what it comes down to is that there's been such significant advancements in these subspecialties across these different functions that they're trying to address, that it's not realistic for one size fits all. Like, I'm going to do all those things and I'm going to do them at an elite level. I think that the feedback that I've gotten is like, that's not a sustainable. It may, like, you may be happy with it for a year, but as everything else advances, they're not going to be able to keep pace with all the other alternatives.
Well, put yourself in the shoes of a software company that's deciding what path it wants to take. Do I want to be really good at one product that becomes like a household name for that particular process? Or do I want to try to build something that gets a huge wallet share for the customers that I have, touches a million different parts of the business? As you're building your business, what is the more realistic path to actually driving revenue? If you have one product that everyone gets a lot of good word of mouth, and you can really focus all your attention on that, you're going to start to grow, and you're going to get adoption, and you're going to get traction. And whereas you may get a big bang with a customer or two if you have this like multi-product suite that you convince a few companies to adopt, but the sales cycle on that type of thing could be 5 years, right? Who has the pain tolerance to wait 5 years to close the big deal, right? Or multiple big deals, right? That's something you grow into over time. So I wonder if no companies are actually going to eventually grow into that now. And it's really like, acquisitions will happen, but they won't be to create a unified suite. They'll just be sort of like a marketplace of products that you have, that one company gets the revenue from, but they're still individual products.
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a lot of investments that have the characteristics of, less integration. Some of it's just, customer expansion, like you just being
Yeah.
able to market to different customers and build off that way. But
Yep.
that's interesting. A couple more questions here, Eric. I'm really glad that you are spending this time with us. I'm curious. What do you think about M&A? The next, 25, 2026? Like, what do you think that we're going to see in terms of deal volume, deal size? What do you see from your vantage point?
So in the technology
Mm-hmm.
space, I think so again, please no one put their house on any of these thoughts that I have. These are just my pure sort of ruminations. It feels like something has to shake up with the market from a technology perspective. And I say that for a couple different reasons. One, there has not been a lot of M&A activity, big picture, amongst all of the hundreds, if not thousands of companies that have emerged over the last decade. They've somehow survived or they've shuttered, but they have not been largely acquired. We haven't seen a lot of big deals happen in the logistics technology arena. I would say. Um, I I also think we after 12 years, if you had told investors, and I know we're talking a lot about the venture world, but I think they've had such an impact on the market over the
Mm-hmm.
last decade. You told venture investors in 2012 that there really wouldn't have been a notable IPO for any product that was invested in over the 12-year period by 2024, they would have had a very different outlook on this market, right? And
Wow.
the amount of money
Yeah.
that has been put into it might be different, right? So the fact that we still don't have sort of like a benchmark acquisition or IPO, I think is hurting the market. And at some point, that's going to turn into some sales that are going to maybe make people shake their heads like, wow, that was less expensive than I thought it was going to be. Or, wow, that company is marketed like crazy. They seem like pretty big. I can't believe they only sold for that. So I would not be shocked to see some significant M&A activity in 25.
Well, take it to the bank, audience. You heard it here
I said
first.
not to take it to the bank.
Well, hey, final question, a little bit of a wild card here. I love the stuff. Great insights. What were some, not necessarily the ones that you wrote, but what were some, maybe one or two stories that were your favorites in the tech world in 2024?
Ooh, interesting. Um, I'll point. Let me think about one from outside. The thing that I was most proud of this year that I did, and I normally don't talk about my own articles, so thanks for teeing me up on that. Um, I did a series of pieces on how the ocean freight booking world had changed over the last 20 years, which seems like this really small, nuanced thing, but it's actually, I think, fairly indicative of how much the software industry catering to the international logistics space has changed, changed and not changed in a way. Like there's still the predominant platform that everyone used, Intra, which was acquired by E to Open about 6 years ago. Um, at one point, they controlled something like half of all the electronic bookings globally for ocean ships.
Wow.
They still have a decent market share, but it's way less than it was 6 years ago. Which these things happen sometimes in acquisitions, right? Like that was the primary product for Intra 6 years ago. As part of ED Open, it's one of many products, and so it was never going to get the same amount of attention. Um, but I think more importantly, just the way electronic processes have sort of become the preferred way of doing things. There were other avenues. You didn't have to go to Intra. You can go created ways to make bookings with ocean carriers that didn't exist 6, 7. For me, an interesting look into like a very nuanced, very niche part of, I don't know, a bigger picture that obviously the interesting to, or I shouldn't say with Amazon, Dave Clark and Flexport.
Right.
Also, to see them sort of try to resurrect Convoy as a brand has been very interesting because everyone has an opinion on both those companies. So, and most people's opinion out of what they read and hear rather than actual having chatted with most of these people and then seeing what other people write, it's very interesting to kind of like compare and contrast that. So,
well, this has Eric. I really appreciate you being here. For those in our audience that want to keep in touch with your writing, what's the best way to do that?
Please post on joc.com. That's definitely the best way to catch what I'm writing. I'm on Twitter day by day. You can also email. Email is not terrible at responding to emails in general, but it's always a good way. It's always a way to get to me.
That's going to do it for us in the hot seat. We will see you next time.